Consider the following report from the Financial Times, published on 16th May 2024, how Slovakia's toxic politics left the Prime Minister fighting for his life. Of course, this was in reference to the attempt on Robert Fico's life on 15th May 2024. Even by the standards of Central Europe's polarized politics, Slovak politicians stand out for their vitriolic discourse. Some of his allies accuse the opposition and the media of having blood on their hands. Vera Jourova, European Commission Vice President, said, and I quote, "All over Europe, we can see increased polarization and hate. We have to understand that verbal violence can lead to physical violence." This, of course, relates to the point of political polarization across much of the Western world, and in particular, even when we look at countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, we see these processes of polarization playing out. Francis Fukuyama, in an article, has written that the end of American hegemony may be due to political polarization at home. Fukuyama further discusses how the domestic instability caused by this polarization at home is metastasizing into these conflicting and divisive cultural identities that is leading to a breakdown in how, the political settlements of these countries ought to at least operate. Indeed, the end of historyism that Fukuyama hypothesized, this idea that liberal democracies are self-evidently the universal method of governance for the whole world to adopt, is self-evidently being disproven right before our very eyes in real time. And not merely is it the case that it has not been accepted universally, but it is also being challenged on multiple fronts, including in the very countries which profess to be the ambassadors of liberal democratic systems. Indeed, increasing polarization at home makes it difficult for these political settlements to operate as they should, and indeed, the political settlements themselves are sowing the seeds for their own destruction, because the freedom of dialogue can only be properly facilitated, can only be properly operationalized when there is some kind of consensus. If everybody disagrees with one another, and if everybody is polarized and radicalized to the point where they have no common ground with one another, it will lead to the breakdown of the democratic system. Thus, the tools the democratic system seeks to preserve are sowing the seeds of its own destruction, contradictorily and ironically. Huntington, in his work Clash of Civilizations, has discussed that every civilization that thought that they were the culmination of all historical development inevitably went into decline. Not only are there external challenges to various different societies and their political settlements, but there are also internal challenges. It is not simply polarization within the system, but the fact that this polarization and radicalization will lead to, inevitably, attempts to break away from or fundamentally alter or change the current political settlement. We also have an understanding of the changing winds of history, as we may be entering upon a new era, and the current political settlement cannot go on forever. Indeed, it is bound to fall at one point or another. The question is as to what exactly will take its place. Thus, we see the gradual shift to multipolarity due to the decline of American hegemonic power over the rest of the world. We also see at home increasing attempts to gatekeep and censor discourse. This, ironically, is just playing into the cycle, as it is just playing into the cycle of more polarization and more radicalization, as further and further attempts are made to gatekeep and censor certain forms of discourse or to gatekeep access to mainstream political discourse, so too will more and more, being disenfranchised, they will run to the fringes and reorganize themselves among these fringe lines. These global and local political issues have an effect on one another, and they play into one another. Thus, the changing conditions of politics at home will have an effect on how these countries will carry out geopolitical foreign policy, and how they will deal with other countries, and how they will interact with one another. We thus see that the left and the right in various Western countries are going more leftwards and more rightwards respectively, and the liberal center consensus is breaking down as we speak in real time. An example of this can be seen in the recent local elections in the United Kingdom, where the Uniparty quote-unquote, aka Labour and Conservative, suffered massive blows. Labour, which of course is currently in power, and Keir Starmer being the Prime Minister, yet they lost over 1,000 seats. In fact, they lost about 1,400 and something seats. That is a major blow. And the Conservatives lost about 500 seats and they came fourth and second respectively. Reform are in the ascendancy, with them coming in first place and having gained over 1,400 seats. The Greens gained about 500 or 550 seats, and the Lib Dems are in third. The results of these local elections, of these local council elections, were truly significant, are truly historical in their implications, because the established political settlement of the United Kingdom of the past 100 years is breaking down. It's truly historic, and that cannot be understated. Nothing like this has happened since the collapse of the Liberal Party in the 1920s. And if not careful, by the next election, Labour and Conservative may cease to be governing forces in and of themselves entirely, and they may fall from power. It is interesting to see the progress that the new right-wing party Reform has made. However, to the right of Reform is a new party, one that is ethno-nationalist, one that is advocating for mass deportations, and its slogan has been that millions must go. And whilst Reform might be the right wing of the Blairite paradigm, Restore represents a threat to the liberal consensus centre that is currently in power in the politics of the United Kingdom, and that is the Restore UK party headed by Rupert Lowe. Farage has had to change his policy to cover his right flank, which is now exposed by the creation of this new Restore UK party. This is why he has had to essentially adopt the kind of mass deportations policy that until that point he had denounced as a political impossibility. Restore UK managed to beat Reform in Great Yarmouth, which was a great shock. They won 10 for 10 possible seats, and this was Lowe's home constituency, so this made sense. Now, the right is increasingly going rightwards. There has been a debate and a series of ideological shifts on the right, especially within the West. There has been a gradual shift from the kind of economically conservative libertarian strand which has dominated the right for the past few decades to a more socially conservative, nationalist, identitarian form of politics, which has a kind of what you could call national socialist or centre-left economics. There is a growing divide within Restore UK itself between the nationalists who want this kind of, economy that is oriented around their ethnic peoples, quote unquote, and between the free market libertarian types. Rupert Lowe himself, as in a past interview, is one of these free market libertarian types. He's very much committed to this kind of Thatcherite economics, this kind of Austrian school libertarian economics, and he is committed to a small state. Thus, this growing divide within the right-wing dissident movement between the nationalists and the libertarians, especially within Restore Britain, is one that is an upcoming division that will occur within that movement. Nevertheless, these new right-wing factions and the way that they will interact with the liberal centre consensus order is coming to a head in the upcoming Makerfield by-elections, what has been dubbed the Battle for Makerfield. This rather over-dramatic title for a local by-election betrays the deeper and more significant ramifications that this election will have on British politics for decades to come. Just for some context, the Labour MP of the Makerfield constituency has stepped down to trigger a by-election. Burnham, who is the Mayor of Manchester, has now taken the place of being the Labour candidate for this constituency. The thinking behind this is as follows. If he manages to win this MP seat, he can trigger a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer within the Labour Party. The logic of a certain faction within Labour is that if Andy Burnham is able to oust Keir Starmer and come into power, they can reorganise Labour around him. Now, will he necessarily be better than Keir Starmer? Of course, the current Prime Minister of the UK is incredibly unpopular, that cannot be understated. But would he necessarily be the saviour for the Labour Party? Would Andy Burnham be a kind of messiah for the Labour Party? I doubt it will be so. The Labour Party is already unpopular as it is, and I don't imagine Burnham as having some kind of exceptional true leader qualities that will allow him to salvage the Labour Party. At best, what he can do is prevent the party from collapsing entirely, but I do not imagine that Labour will maintain power come 2029. In any case, Reform are running a local candidate, Robert Kenyon, who is a local plumber, and they are going for the aesthetic of the local, hard-working, patriotic Britishman. Of course, Robert Kenyon has stirred some controversy due to some comments he made, some inappropriate jokes he passed about a woman a few years ago. But nevertheless, this should have been a two-horse race. And I say that this should have been a two-horse race because the new player in British politics, Restore Britain, has come into play here. Restore are running local businesswoman Rebecca Shepherd, and what is interesting is that it seems as if Restore may end up dividing the right-wing voter base between themselves and Reform. If that is the case, it will be interesting to see if they successfully challenge Reform, if they manage to tap into the non-voter disenfranchised class which they claim to tap into. Because again, the logic that Restore Britain are operating under is that there is a disenfranchised non-voter class that is waiting for true representation of quote-unquote the native British peoples. As such, Reform are facing this new threat from their right, a threat which may end up eating into their voter base and hence depriving them of a victory. As such now, it has become an important battle for the makeup, the configuration of British politics. Not only is it a battleground for the new factions, for the new ideologies of the right, but it is also a battle between the new right-wing forces, whether they be in the form of Reform or in the form of Restore, and the liberal centre consensus order in the form of Labour. I honestly do have a feeling that Restore may pull a shocker, or at least will perform way better than what most people imagine that they will. Now, most importantly, this brings me back onto my original point about the Slop outrage machine, about the polarization and the radicalization of discourse. Richard IV on his YouTube channel and Dr. Nima Parvini, aka Academic Agent, make good points regarding this. Richard IV approaches this from a kind of spiritual Christian esoteric lens, and Dr. Nima Parvini, aka Academic Agent, uses elite theory to analyze this as, the kind of political rage and political anger being channeled down safe avenues of dissent. In other words, what they want, what the elites quote unquote want, is for you to be angry. They want you to be angry, but then instead of you channeling that down meaningful avenues, they want you to direct that anger into certain solutions, quote unquote, that they will sell you. They want to control your reactions and your counter reactions. They want to facilitate certain false dialectics and thus manufacture consent for their supposed solutions, which really just spell out into crimes and atrocities and state tyranny and oppression and whatnot. On a more broader level, this is why, for example, although I am critical of the genocide of the Palestinians by the Israeli state, the genocidal actions of that ethno-state, although I am critical of that, I will also point out that we have to be careful not to fall into the kind of ridiculous collective guilt narrative of it's the Jews. Or when addressing issues with Jewish supremacism, or with how certain Zionists are using certain religious texts in a misinterpreting manner, or they are misinterpreting certain religious texts, we should not associate that with Judaism or the Jewish religion as a whole. It's an obvious psyop to redirect rightful anger at a certain genocidal ethno-state and instead direct it in order to collectively guilt a whole group of peoples. It kind of misses the point here. Similarly, we can critique things like Western colonialism, or we can critique, let's just say, a certain funny mustache man from the 1940s. However, what's currently happened, or what has happened over the past few decades, is that any expression of European native identity, or any expression of a kind of native tradition among the European peoples has been silenced and censored in order to prevent some kind of supposed atrocities from being committed again. And it really is missing the forest for the trees, or it's confusing two things. You know, just because somebody expresses their native identity, or just because certain expressions of tradition are made, does not mean that they will automatically resort to state tyranny, or that, you know, the peoples of a certain nation should be blamed or collectively guilted based on the crimes of their ancestors, and therefore they have no right to their own traditions. In a similar vein, just because we are right to critique the empires of the West does not mean that we should facilitate their consequences, and this is one of the great ironies of the current establishment, the current political settlement, in that it will be critical of the empires of old, the empires of the past era of history, but they will not address the consequences of that in our current era of history, whether it be, you know, neo-imperialism, continued foreign intervention and adventurism within other lands, quite frankly, or things like mass immigration, the erosion of native identities globally. The consequences of that imperialism and the continuation of that in the form of neo-imperialism, and the continuation of its consequences in the form of these policies like mass immigration or the erosion of native identities, for example, are not addressed. Obviously, as a Muslim, I can talk for myself here when I say that if we would critique Islamic extremism, this obviously should not mean Islam as a whole is bad, nor does this mean that if we critique certain practices within Muslim countries or certain practices within certain Muslim cultures, it does not mean that Muslims as a whole are guilty. We should collectively guilt and punish all of them. Similarly, this gets onto an issue in a lot of contemporary politics. We can criticize immigration policy, and the consequences of it, and indeed the structural causes of it, because immigration, mass immigration, is a consequence of empire, not of nation. You know, genuine national self-determination is in distinction and in fact in contradiction to the consequences of empire, just to put that in a non-blunt manner. However, this does not mean that we should attack immigrant communities. This does not mean that we should attack black peoples or Asian peoples or Hispanic peoples. In fact, Dr. Nima Parvini talks about how anger is directed at the client groups and not directed at the elites or those in power. You know, the average black person is just a hard-working, honest person, you know, and there are genuine issues when it comes to certain ethnic minorities in terms of how the police treats them, how they are treated in society. I don't think those things should be ignored. Yes, there are issues with organized crime in certain immigrant communities, unfortunately, but it is not some kind of deterministic fate that they must all be criminals or whatever. This kind of collective guilting and collective judgment of black people as a whole, or Muslims as a whole, or Asians or Hispanics as a whole, based on the actions of some people within their communities, is an obvious psyop to misdirect anger at a whole group of peoples. Similarly, in another vein, we can absolutely criticize nationalism, criticize exclusionary ideologies, criticize the misdirecting of patriotism down avenues which are obvious psyops, so to speak. But this does not discredit patriotism as a whole. This should not discredit patriotism as a whole. This should not discredit any nativist sentiment, any nativist tradition, any sense of belonging to a certain nation, such as amongst white peoples or Europeans or amongst Christians. And they don't have to dissolve what fundamentally constitutes those identities and those traditions and what makes them unique. Hence, we can have the Western nations preserve their host majority ethnic groups, whilst at the same time they can respect immigrants, respect different cultures, respect different peoples. You don't have to go to either extreme. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Peoples can preserve their countries whilst being accepting of immigrants and their cultures as well. You can maintain the host ethnic majority of any country and their culture, but not be disrespectful to immigrants. You can still respect them, still benefit from them, and still be tolerant and open towards them. And you can still address issues that face both of those communities or all of them. Both things can be true at the same time. That is why collective guilt is something that we must avoid at all costs. Indeed, the reality is that it is all of these groups and none of these groups simultaneously who are at fault here. Indeed, there are the elites from all of these groups who have their own interests. These elites at times work with one another if they have coinciding interests. If they have differing and competing interests, they may even backstab, betray, and come into conflict and division with one another. However, it is the common people who suffer in the game of politics, in the game of life which these people play, for resources or for whatever. Thus, it is important not to collectively guilt a whole population based off the actions of some of them. Indeed, many of the greatest atrocities and crimes against humanity could have been prevented if people kept this one principle in mind. Thus, the cycle of hate always continues as Group X blames Group Y blames Group Z blames Group X, etc., and etc., and the cycle goes on. We also see these false dialectics playing out in another way. That is when certain ideals are presented as binaries in conflict with one another. There are different binaries that can be given, such as the secular and the non-secular, the religious and the scientific, the individualist versus the collectivist. However, in many cases, just because a certain ideal is hijacked or rejected by a certain group doesn't make it correct or incorrect. A thing can be true or false in and of itself, regardless of if it is used for good or for bad. In any case, we must understand reality as it is and come to terms with whether something is right or wrong, regardless of how it is used by any given political or ideological or philosophical or religious or other faction. P.F. Young makes a valid point regarding the difference between positive polarities and positive negative polarities. Indeed, more than one thing can be true at the same time. For example, An example of a positive-positive polarity that is often confused for a positive-negative polarity is the individualist and collectivist divide. In reality, a healthy society would balance and maintain and emphasize both of these. A society which is either too individualist or too collectivist would be dysfunctional and quite dystopian, quite frankly. And so a healthy society would have a healthy balance between the individualist and the collectivist. Coming to the end of this video, just remember, do not fall into the traps of collective guilt, do not fall into these false dialectics, and do not let them redirect your anger into means or methods which do not address anything and simply play into the hands of the elites and simply lead to the worst atrocities and the worst attitudes of all towards other groups of people.